The microphone slipped half an inch in Dean Martin's hand as his eyes locked onto the empty VIP booth seat in the front row, the same seat where his son had sat 3 nights earlier, and his voice cracked mid-verse of "Everybody Loves Somebody," while 2,000 people held their breath, wondering why the King of Cool went so silent. Wait, because what happened next wasn't just a performance interrupted. It was the moment Dean Martin's carefully built armor shattered in front of the world, and the cost of that crack would follow him until his last breath. It was March 24th, 1987, and the Bally's casino showroom in Las Vegas smelled like cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and real money. Dean Martin stood center stage in his signature black tuxedo, a rocks glass filled with what the audience assumed was whiskey, but was actually apple juice positioned on the small bar cart to his left, exactly where it always sat during his performances. The stage lights were white and hot, the kind that makes sweat bead on your temples within the first 5 minutes, but Dean looked cool as ever. 70 years old and still carrying that effortless charm that had made him a legend. The orchestra behind him was halfway through the bridge when he stopped singing, just stopped. The band kept playing for another 2 bars before the conductor noticed and cut them off with a sharp hand gesture. The showroom went from laughter and applause to absolute silence in less than 3 seconds. Dean's hand was still wrapped around the microphone, but his arm had dropped to his side. His eyes were fixed on a spot in the front section, booth 7, where a single red velvet chair sat empty under a small table lamp. The people in the surrounding booths shifted uncomfortably, some craning their necks to see what had stolen the performer's attention, others whispering to their companions in hushed confusion. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? A woman in booth 9, sitting 3 tables away from the empty seat, would later tell a reporter that she saw Dean's face change in real time. She said his jaw tightened, his eyes went glassy, and for just a moment, he looked like a man who'd been punched in the chest and was trying not to show it. She said she'd never seen someone look so broken while standing so still. Her husband, a casino executive who'd seen Dean perform dozens of times over the years, said he knew instantly that something was terribly wrong, because Dean Martin never broke character, never lost his composure, never let the audience see behind the curtain. Frank Sinatra was sitting in booth 12, off to the side, partially hidden by a support column. He'd flown in that afternoon as a surprise, planning to join Dean on stage for a duet later in the set. Sinatra leaned forward, his hand gripping the edge of the table, and his eyes darted between Dean and the empty seat. He knew what that chair meant. He knew whose chair it was supposed to be. And he knew why it was empty. 3 nights earlier, on March 21st, Dean Paul Martin, Dean's son, had been sitting in that exact seat. Dean Paul, 35 years old, a captain in the California Air National Guard, had driven down from March Air Force Base to catch his father's show before a scheduled training mission. He wasn't just Dean's son, he was Dean's pride, a former teen heartthrob who'd sung in the pop group Duino, Desi and Billy alongside Desi Arnaz Jr., a tennis champion, an actor, and a fighter pilot who'd traded Hollywood for the cockpit of an F-4 Phantom. He'd told his father he'd be back soon to catch another performance. Dean had joked with him between songs, pointed him out to the crowd, said something about his boy being tougher than he ever was, because he flew jets while Dean just sang into a microphone. The audience had laughed. Dean Paul had smiled and raised his glass in a small salute. That was the last time Dean Martin saw his son alive. On the morning of March 21st, Dean Paul's F-4 Phantom jet had taken off from March Air Force Base during a snowstorm. Visibility was nearly zero. The plane climbed to 9,300 feet, then vanished from radar. Air traffic control at Ontario Airport tried to reach the pilot to warn him about Mount San Gorgonio directly in his flight path, but the radio command either didn't get through or wasn't heard in time. The jet slammed into the mountain at 400 miles per hour, killing Dean Paul and his weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, instantly. The wreckage was scattered across Wood Canyon in Riverside County, buried in snow and twisted metal, and it took search teams 3 days to locate the crash site. Dean Martin had been sleeping when the phone call came through. It was early afternoon on the 21st, and he'd been resting in his suite at Bally's after a late night. The curtains drawn against the desert sun, the room dark and quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but direct, the kind of tone used by people who deliver terrible news for a living, practiced and careful and utterly devoid of emotion. "There's been an accident. Your son's plane. We're still searching, but the radar contact was lost." Dean didn't remember hanging up the phone. He didn't remember sitting down. The next thing he knew, Frank Sinatra was in the room, standing in front of him with his hands on Dean's shoulders, and someone was saying his name over and over, the syllables blurring together into a rhythm that sounded like a prayer or a warning. Sinatra had his own history with plane crashes. His mother, Dolly, had died in a plane crash a decade earlier, in 1977, when her chartered jet went down on Mount San Gorgonio, the same mountain where Dean Paul's jet would later crash. Sinatra knew the waiting, the hoping, the slow, crushing realization that hope was a lie you told yourself to. Survive the next 5 minutes. He stayed with Dean through the night, through the endless phone calls, through the confirmation that came just before dawn. Dean Paul Martin was gone. Notice how the story hasn't told you yet what Dean did on that stage after he went silent, because the silence itself is the key to understanding everything that followed. The funeral was private, held at the Los Angeles National Cemetery on a gray morning where the clouds hung low and heavy over the rows of white headstones that stretched in perfect lines toward the horizon. Dean stood in a black suit that hung a little looser on him than it had a week earlier, the fabric gathering at his shoulders in a way that made him look smaller, older, diminished. He didn't cry, at least not where anyone could see. He shook hands, accepted condolences, stared at the coffin draped in an American flag, and said almost nothing. Jerry Lewis, his former partner and estranged friend for 20 years, showed up unannounced. He didn't speak to anyone, just stood in the back and watched. When Dean heard about it later, he called Lewis and they talked for hours. It was the first real conversation they'd had in 2 decades, and it centered entirely on grief, on fathers and sons, on the things you can't control no matter how famous or powerful you are. Dean's daughter, Dina, said later that her father was never the same after the crash. She said he became quieter, more distant, that the light in his eyes dimmed and never fully came back. "My father's body was still here," she would tell a friend, "but his soul was gone." But Dean had commitments. He had contracts. He had shows booked at Bally's, and canceling them would mean letting down thousands of people who'd paid good money and planned their trips around seeing him perform. So, 3 days after burying his son, Dean Martin walked back onto that stage. The first 2 shows after the funeral were mechanical. He hit his marks, sang his songs, delivered his jokes with the same timing and charm that had made him a star for 40 years. But the people who knew him, the people who'd watched him perform for decades, could see the difference. The smile didn't reach his eyes. The pauses between songs lasted a beat too long. The banter with the audience felt rehearsed instead of spontaneous. And Booth 7, the VIP seat where Dean Paul sat 3 nights before, remained empty. Dean had told the venue staff not to seat anyone there. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. Listen, because this is where the real story begins, not with the grief itself, But with the exact moment grief became visible to 2,000 strangers. It was the third show, March 24th, and Dean was halfway through Everybody Loves Somebody, the song that had knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot in 1964, the song that defined his solo career, the song he'd sung 10,000 times in 10,000 venues. He was on the second verse, his voice smooth and controlled, the orchestra swelling behind him, the audience swaying gently in their seats. And then his eyes drifted to booth 7, the empty chair, the table lamp casting a small circle of light on the polished wood surface, the untouched drink that a waiter had placed there out of habit before realizing the seat was reserved but unoccupied. Dean's voice caught. He pushed through the next line, but his pitch wavered just slightly, just enough that the musicians noticed. The conductor glanced back at the brass section, a silent question hanging in the air. Dean took a breath, tried to continue, and then his hand dropped, the microphone pulling away from his mouth, and the sound cut out. The band kept playing for 2 more bars, the violins carrying the melody, and then the conductor's hand came down hard and everything stopped. 2,000 people sat in complete silence. Dean stared at the empty seat. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths, the kind of breathing you do when you're trying not to fall apart in public. His left hand, the one not holding the microphone, curled into a fist at his side, then relaxed, then curled again. A woman in the front row started to clap, thinking maybe this was part of the act, some kind of dramatic pause before a big finish, but her applause died quickly when no one else joined in. Frank Sinatra pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't move toward the stage yet, just stood there, ready to step in if needed, his face tight with concern. The showroom manager, standing near the back by the sound booth, picked up a phone and whispered something into the receiver. The bartenders stopped pouring drinks. The waitresses froze mid-step. Every eye in the room was on Dean Martin, waiting to see what would happen next. Remember this moment because it's the hinge point between the performer and the father, between the legend and the man, and what Dean chose to do in the next 60 seconds would define how people remembered him for the rest of his life. Dean closed his eyes. He stood there, microphone at his side, eyes closed, under white stage lights that were too bright and too hot, and for 10 full seconds, he didn't move. Some people in the audience thought he was having a heart attack. Others thought he was drunk, even though everyone who knew him knew the drunk act was just an act. A few people started to whisper, nervous murmurs rippling through the room, and then Dean opened his eyes, lifted the microphone back to his mouth, and spoke. "I'm sorry, folks." His voice was quieter than usual, rougher around the edges, stripped of the smooth charm that usually coated every word. "I thought I could do this tonight. I really did." He paused, looked down at the stage floor, then back up at the audience. "My son died 4 days ago. Some of you probably read about it in the papers. He was a pilot. Good kid. Better man than I ever was." The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer confused or uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2,000 people collectively hold their breath because they know they're witnessing something raw and unrehearsed. "He used to sit right there," Dean pointed to booth 7, and every head in the showroom turned to look at the empty chair. "3 nights ago he was here, told me he'd be back in a few days to catch another show, and I believed him, because you always believe the people you love when they say they'll see you soon." His voice cracked on the word soon, and he stopped talking. He gripped the microphone with both hands now, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Frank Sinatra started walking toward the stage. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Dean. The audience watched Sinatra cross the showroom floor, and a few people recognized him and gasped, but no one applauded, no one called out his name. This wasn't a performance. This was something else entirely. Stop for a second and picture the room from above, because what you're about to see only makes sense when you understand the geography of that moment. Dean stood center stage, alone, under a single spotlight that turned everything outside its circle into shadow. The orchestra sat behind him, instruments resting on their laps, waiting for direction that wasn't coming. The audience filled the showroom in a semicircle of booths and tables, all of them facing the stage, all of them watching a man try to hold himself together in real time. And Frank Sinatra walked through the middle of it all, a line drawn from the back of the room straight to the front, his footsteps the only sound in a space designed to hold music and laughter. Sinatra climbed the 3 steps onto the stage and walked up to Dean. He didn't say anything. He just stood next to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he looked out at the audience with an expression that said, very clearly, "This is my friend, and you will give him the space he needs." Dean turned to look at Sinatra, and for just a moment, his face crumpled. Not crying, not breaking down, just a flicker of something too big to name passing across his features. Sinatra put a hand on Dean's shoulder, a firm grip, the kind that says, "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere," and Dean nodded once, a tiny movement that only Sinatra would have caught. Then Dean turned back to the audience. "I'm going to finish this set," he said, his voice steadier now, still rough, but no longer on the edge of collapse. "Because that's what we do. We finish what we start. But I need you all to know that I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for him." He pointed again to the empty chair. "Because he loved watching me perform. He thought it was magic, even though I told him 100 times it was just work, just practice, just showing up night after night and hitting the notes. He believed in the magic. Anyway, so I'm going to give him one more show, even if he's not here to see it." The audience didn't applaud, they just waited. Dean nodded to the conductor, who raised his baton. The orchestra picked up where they'd left off, easing back into "Everybody Loves Somebody" with a gentleness that hadn't been there before, like they were holding the song with careful hands. Dean lifted the microphone and started singing again. His voice was different now. It was stripped down, vulnerable, every word carrying weight that hadn't been there in the first half of the song. He wasn't performing anymore. He was surviving, and the audience knew it. Notice how the question isn't whether Dean finished the show, it's what finishing the show cost him, and whether anyone in that room understood the price. He made it through "Everybody Loves Somebody." He made it through "That's Amore." He made it through a medley of standards that included "Ain't That a Kick in the Head" and "Volare," and every single note sounded like it was being pulled out of him with pliers. Sinatra stayed on stage the whole time, standing off to the side, out of the spotlight, just present. At one point during "Memories Are Made of This," Sinatra stepped forward and joined Dean in a duet that hadn't been planned, their voices blending in a way that reminded everyone in the room why these 2 men had been legends for decades. When the set ended, Dean didn't take a bow. He just nodded to the audience, set the microphone down on the bar cart, and walked off stage. Sinatra followed him. The audience sat in stunned silence for a full 10 seconds before someone started clapping, and then the entire showroom erupted into applause. Not the enthusiastic, energetic applause you hear after a great performance, but something slower, heavier, the kind of applause that's less about entertainment and more about respect. Backstage, Dean collapsed into a chair in his dressing room. He didn't cry. He just sat there, staring at the wall, his hands shaking slightly. Sinatra poured him a real drink this time, not apple juice, and set it on the table in front of him. Dean didn't touch it. "You did good, Dino," Sinatra said quietly. Dean shook his head. "I don't know if I can do this again, Frank. I don't know if I've got it in me." Sinatra sat down across from him. "You don't have to decide that tonight. You just have to get through tonight. Tomorrow's a different problem." Wait, because the story of that night isn't complete without understanding what happened in the weeks and months that followed. Dean Martin finished out his contract at the Golden Nugget, but every performance after March 24th felt like he was walking through quicksand. He hit the notes, he delivered the jokes, but the spark was gone. The people who came to see him could feel it. They still applauded, still laughed in the right places, but there was an undercurrent of sadness in every show, a shared understanding that they were watching a man go through the motions because he didn't know what else to do. In 1988, a year after Dean Paul's death, Sinatra convinced Dean to join him and Sammy Davis Jr. for a reunion tour, the three surviving members of the Rat Pack back together one more time. The tour was called Together Again, and it was supposed to be a celebration, a victory lap for three legends who'd defined an era. But Dean only made it through a few shows before he told Sinatra he couldn't continue. He said he was tired. He said his back hurt. He said a lot of things that were technically true, but didn't touch the real reason, which was that every time he stepped on stage, he saw that empty chair in his mind, and it was too much. Sinatra was furious, not at Dean, but at the situation, at the unfairness of it, at the fact that grief doesn't care about contracts or legacy or what the audience paid to see. He tried to convince Dean to stay, offered to restructure the entire tour around his needs, but Dean was done. He left the tour, went home to Los Angeles, and essentially disappeared from public life. Sinatra didn't speak to him for 2 years, not because he was angry, but because he didn't know what to say, and neither did Dean. Listen to what happened next, because it reveals something most people never knew about Dean Martin's final years. Dean became a recluse. He stayed in his Beverly Hills home, rarely leaving except for doctor's appointments or the occasional quiet dinner with family. He stopped recording music. He stopped taking meetings. His daughter Dina said he would sit in his den for hours, just staring out the window, a drink in his hand that he barely touched. In 1993, 2 years before Dean's death, Sinatra reached out. He called Dean's house and left a message saying he missed him, that he was sorry for the distance, that he wanted to see him. Dean called back the same day, and they talked for 3 hours. Sinatra later told a close friend that Dean sounded different, older, like someone who'd already started saying goodbye to the world, even though he was still in it. They met for lunch weeks later at a private club in Beverly Hills. Sinatra brought up the tour the night Dean had walked off stage in 1988, and Dean apologized. Sinatra told him there was nothing to apologize for, that he understood, that he'd always understood. They talked about Dean Paul, about the crash, about how Sinatra's own mother had died on the same mountain. They talked about grief, about how it never really goes away. It just becomes part of the furniture in your head, something you learn to walk around but never fully ignore. Before you go on, you need to understand one thing about Dean's rule for himself after his son's death. He made a decision sometime in those dark months after the funeral that he would never let another audience see him break the way he'd broken on March 24, 1987. He would either perform with full control or he wouldn't perform at all. And since full control felt impossible, he chose not to perform. That choice cost him his career, his public identity, the thing he'd built his entire adult life around. But it also protected him from having to relive that moment on stage, that moment when 2,000 people watched him confront the worst thing that had ever happened to him in real time. Some people thought Dean gave up. Some people thought he lost his will to fight. But the people who knew him, the people who loved him, understood that he was doing the only thing he could do to survive. He was stepping off the stage, out of the spotlight, away from the expectation that he would always be the king of cool, always be charming, always be okay. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, at the age of 78. The official cause of death was acute respiratory failure from emphysema, decades of smoking finally catching up to him, but his family knew the truth. He'd been dying slowly since March 21, 1987, the day his son's jet went down. Everything after that was just his body catching up to what his heart already knew. At Dean's funeral, Frank Sinatra gave a eulogy. He talked about their friendship, their years performing together, their fights and reconciliations. And then he talked about Dean Paul, about how losing a child changes a person in ways that can't be undone, about how Dean had carried that loss with grace, even when grace felt impossible. Sinatra's voice broke twice during the eulogy, and he had to stop and collect himself before continuing. He ended by saying that Dean Martin had been one of the bravest men he'd ever known, not because of anything he did on stage, but because of how he'd survived the worst thing life could throw at him and still found a way to keep going, even if it was just for a little while longer. Hold this moment in your mind, because when we come back to it, you won't see it the same way. Years after Dean's death, a reporter tracked down the woman from booth 9, the one who'd been sitting near the empty chair on March 24, 1987. She was in her 70s by then, living in a retirement community in Arizona, but she remembered that night with perfect clarity. She said she thought about it often, especially when she was having a hard time with something in her own life. She said watching Dean Martin stand on that stage, shaking and broken but still standing, had taught her something about resilience that she'd carried with her ever since. The reporter asked her what she thought Dean's legacy was, and she didn't talk about his music or his movies or his charm. She talked about that moment of silence, that 40-second stretch when the entire showroom held its breath and watched a father grieve in public. She said that was the moment Dean Martin became more than an entertainer. He became human, fully and undeniably human, and that was worth more than any song he ever sang. The Bally's casino closed booth 7 after Dean's death and never reassigned it. For years, it sat empty, a small plaque placed on the table that read, "Reserved." The casino didn't explain who it was reserved for, and most patrons assumed it was some kind of VIP policy, but the staff knew. They knew it was reserved for the ghost of a pilot who'd loved watching his father perform, and for the memory of a night when grief and performance collided on a Las Vegas stage, and neither one walked away unchanged. In 2003, Bally's underwent renovations, and the booth was removed. The plaque disappeared. The new owners didn't know the history, or if they did, they didn't think it mattered. But the people who'd been there that night, the people who'd watched Dean Martin stop mid-song and stare at an empty chair, they remembered. They remembered because some moments are too heavy to forget, no matter how much time passes. If you want to hear what really happened, the night Frank Sinatra tried to bring Dean back on stage one more time in 1995, just before Dean died, tell me in the comments.